Kicked off Pendo about 8 years ago, and now have built it to a pretty sizable company. 2.6 billion in valuation, a little over 100 million in ARR as of our funding round in the summer.
My name is Kevin David, and if you want real financial freedom for yourselves and for your loved ones today, then the time is now. And I will be there to help you every step of the way. What is up, everybody, and welcome back to another exciting podcast, your favorite or soon-to-be favorite podcast, Kevin David Experience. Today we have a very special guest, and I know I always say that because it's always true. So today we're going to be getting into entrepreneurship. We're going to be getting into the good, the bad, and the ugly of building multi-million dollar companies and what it takes to do that. So welcome Eric Boduch, who's joining us from Raleigh, North Carolina. The first question that we ask everybody, Eric, is to describe your entrepreneurial journey all the way up until right now in 60 seconds or less. And I know it's hard.
Wow, that is hard because I, like you, started kind of early. I remember doing anything for an extra dollar, so to speak. So had a little concession stand when I was in high school at the local pond selling stuff. Sold, did like gift baskets for students during college. Even kind of ran afoul of the local, I think it was Marriott Food Services that owned Carnegie Mellon's food service contract by selling Subway subs on campus because our food is horrible. So I brought Subway subs in and just sold them, made a nice little buck doing that. So my entrepreneurial journey started pretty early. Did a startup right out of school called Cerebellum Software, raised 10, 12, ended up being about $14 million. Rode up and down during the internet times, so saw the good and bad of the dot-com days. And then a mix of public and startup companies since then. And my latest one is Pendo, which is actually my co-founder from Cerebellum right out of school, Carnegie Mellon alumni like me. Kicked off Pendo about 8 years ago, and now have built it to a pretty sizable company. 2.6 billion in valuation, a little over 100 million in ARR as of our funding round in the summer.
I love that. That's insane. 8 years, over $2 billion valuation, $100 million ARR. That means that you guys are making almost $10 million a month?
Yeah. I mean, it's cranking. So
that's
exciting.
Insane. $10 million a month. I love that. And so what's your opinion about being an entrepreneur versus, going the 9-to-5 route? Is one better or worse?
Well, I mean, I'm like talking to a like mind here. So I think there's entrepreneurship in a lot of people out there. And if you're the person that likes to create, that likes to get involved early, that likes to own your own time, that doesn't mind taking a little bit of risk, then why not go the entrepreneurship route? Especially if you're young. It's something you can, when you're young, you can experiment with it and not worry too much about all your responsibilities. So the youngest is probably the easiest time to do it because you don't have kids, you don't have a wife, or you probably don't have kids, don't have a wife. It just gives you the ability to do things that you couldn't really do. I remember when we first started Cerebellum out of school, I think I started paying myself like 20 grand or 30 grand a year, as part of the business, and everything else got pumped back into it. If you were in your 40s or your 50s and had a mortgage and a house and a wife and kids and college today, there's no way you could probably do that unless you had saved a big nest egg, right? And then it becomes harder. So I do think if you're going to give it a shot, especially in the beginning, the beginning's the time to do it. When you're young, when you don't have as many responsibilities, and see if entrepreneurship is for you. Now, I do think there's programs and things that people are doing, especially for experienced professionals in tech now, that make it easier when you're older and when you have more, responsibilities to also jump into entrepreneurship. But it's super simple when you're young to take that risk and see if it's for you.
And an interesting part too, because I talk to a lot of successful entrepreneurs, and like an overwhelming majority of them had like little side hustles when they were younger. Like people had like lemonade stands or gift baskets or like this or that. It's like an interesting kind of pattern that I've realized. Why do you think that is, right? Like, do you think people are born entrepreneurs, or do you think that they become it? But because if people aren't born entrepreneurs, then why does almost everyone I talk to have some sort of like little side hustle, like even when they're like kids and they don't even understand what entrepreneurship even is potentially?
Yeah, no, I was exactly the same way. I was making money from writing some computer code and fixing things, and it always had that, like we talked about the concession stand back when I was in high school, but even before that, I would help people fix their computers, for 10, $20 and that kind of stuff. Um, I do think in some people entrepreneurship is born, like they gravitate to those types of risks and those types of companies and kind of working for themselves. I also think entrepreneurs, though, can be made. I think there's people that have started in the 9 to 5 and didn't have those early side hustles, but gravitate to the idea of building a company and maybe not necessarily even being an entrepreneur, but more being a CEO, right? And being a CEO at an early stage company. And I think we can do more to support those kinds of people and those kinds of companies than we do today. It's one of the reasons I'm looking at kicking off a venture studio is to help people that have a lot to offer, that would be great founders and would be great CEOs, kick off and create companies where they might be in a position unlike, the 20-year-old or 22-year-old leaving college, where they have a kid or they have a mortgage and their risk tolerance isn't quite as high. So,
Right.
that's one of the reasons I look at kind of that early asset class in venture capital, that early stage venture capital, and thinking it can be a little bit different, and really like this whole, venture studio model. So,
Yeah, and it's interesting too because a friend of a friend that lives here in Miami runs a company called Atomic, which is basically like I guess what I would categorize as a venture studio, but in a
yeah, no,
slightly
absolutely. Atomic Jack over on, oh, I think of them as San Francisco, but I think they have a pretty big presence there in Miami now too.
Yeah, well, I think they moved out here. Yeah, so I mean that I always look at like business models because one of the books I read a long time ago stuck with me. They talked about like the value chain or something. I forget exactly what they called it, but they made the comparison between the airport itself and Expedia and like which is a better business model, right? One has the depreciation, the employees, the buildings, all the expenses. One has none of that and makes more money on a per ticket basis than the airport itself does, right? And so like from a business model perspective, running some sort of venture studio where like up and coming entrepreneurs come to you, pitch you ideas, and then not taking as like passive of a kind of approach like a lot of venture capitalists do, but more so being involved, taking equity stakes, right? Using your expertise to kind of help these beginner or starting entrepreneurs. I think that's one of the most exciting business models that I've heard about because I genuinely enjoy doing that. You get to work and give back to the youth, and you also get to be like an active investor.
Absolutely, I agree. I mean, Atomic's a great example of venture studio. We're looking at doing called 24andup.com, focused on, B2B SaaS, right? So a little bit different than the thesis behind Atomic, but similar. I do think that model is the way to do early stage investments because you can bring that operational experience to bear, right? I've seen a company grow from 0 to 100 million in ARR. I helped build the whole go-to-market behind that. There's a lot of value those types of people can bring beyond just money.
Right.
And I think that's most important in those first 24 months when you're kicking off a company.
Right. Yeah, I agree. So let's talk about Pendo when you first got that started. How did the
Absolutely.
idea come about, right? And then like what were the first kind of initial months or traction? What was that like?
It's interesting because Pendo maybe is a little atypical in some way in that didn't necessarily start because of the idea, but it started because Todd and I wanted to work together again, and we wanted to start a company. And then we got Raul and Jane, third co-founder, involved. And a little bit later, as the idea was settled, Eric Trone, who was our fourth co-founder. So Pendo, I think in some ways is kind of in the minority in that we started with this team approach and then went and actually vetted some different ideas. It turned out that a lot of us had a background in product, or all of us had some background in product management. We all had felt pain in the whole product area. So we thought about that, knew that we would be customers for our own product, at our past companies, and so built the product around that, built the product around giving a platform for product teams that they never really had before. Because we were always, when we were building products, we'd be, writing code where we didn't have to. We'd be using things like Project and Excel, right? There wasn't really tool sets for product management, even though product is like arguably the most important part of a software company, right? I mean, if you don't have a good product, what are you selling? What are you marketing? What are you
Right.
raising money for?
And the interesting part about that too is, right, because like a lot of the kind of, I guess, traditional startup advice, if you will, is, most of the time you don't hear about more than like 2 or 3 co-founders, but it sounds like you have 4. Is that right?
There is 4, which is a little unusual. I've heard, companies having 5 or 6 or 7, but it just the equity split becomes a little bit harder, as you can imagine, because there's only 100% to divide, no matter how many, numerators you have there. Denominator is always 100. So, it becomes a little bit more difficult. I think we were probably a little unusual that way. It also made it a lot easier to grow faster. I had a pretty strong marketing background. Eric Trone had a really strong engineering background. Todd had a strong product background and turned out to be a great salesperson on top of that. And Raul ended up, who had a background in the venture capital community and a lot of connections in the area, kind of covering just a huge base of everything else we needed. So having a really deep team helped us be successful. I think all of the founders had a huge impact on where Pendo ended up. Without any of us, I think it would have been harder to get where we got as quickly as we did. But yeah, 4 I would say is not usual. Usually you'd probably see 2 or 3.
And
One's tough too for the opposite reason. So.
Right. Yeah. And another interesting way that you guys, I think, are slightly different than, quote unquote, the norm. And I mean, what does the norm actually mean? But just like what the traditional kind of startup advice is the fact that most of the time, right, the kind of conventional wisdom is, build a company for one of your own problems. But it sounds like you guys kind of did the opposite approach where you said, hey, here are some really smart people. Let's think of an idea because we want to be in business together. How did you actually go about validating those initial ideas? Or first of all, how did you come up with the ideas? And then how did you validate and ultimately select one?
Yeah, so we went through kind of a vetting, procedure. I wouldn't say that there was a sophisticated rubric or something in place, but we went through a number of different companies, and we actually almost ended up in the finance space, planning software, maybe something similar to like an Anaplan with a different target market. We started down that path and then realized, back to your first point, that none of us were particularly passionate about that space, or at least there wasn't enough of that passion. And so we actually, went to idea number 2, which was an area that was solving our own problem. Like, we'd all worked in product before. We all had this problem of how do you understand how customers are using your software? And the only way to solve that back then was instrumenting, and instrumenting, meant a huge amount of work, just engineering, usage that could go to building core features instead went to instrumentation. So we said, let's solve that problem. Let's build a no-code or low-code solution to getting product analytics, and that's where Pendo started. And then we added in guidance, we added in surveys and NPS, we added in feedback, and really built out this really robust platform for product management teams, which is what we continue to build on today. We've always looked at ourselves as like the best friends of the product community. Like, it's built by product people for product people, and so we ended up really pivoting really early before the company started to an idea that was a problem we had. But it did start with the core team thinking about different ideas, where there's big business problems and which ones we wanted to go after, and ended up in an area that was attacking a problem that we were very, very familiar with.
And then what's your advice for beginners starting out, or I mean, maybe it wasn't the same for you because you had already you'd already, started a company before, but right, there's kind of like this dichotomy where, you want to naturally build and finish and perfect a product before you release it because you want it to be good, right? But then there's also like the other frame of mind where you say, listen, you have to kind of like fire before you aim, where you have to like, kind of release something, even if it's full of bugs, like, we've seen Windows do a number of different times. What's your opinion on how much time you should take building the product before you start getting feedback and releasing it?
I like to get product in people's hands as quickly as possible, but there's a caveat to that. Like, a lot of people are like, I have to do these 7 things in my product, and I'll push those 7 things out and they'll all be buggy. And they'll think that that's a good solution. And my argument was like, don't do those 7 things, even though maybe your product needs those 7, before it's a full-fledged product. Why don't you do 3 of them and make sure they're not buggy, right? Make sure they at least deliver some value to your customers. So I would instead of pushing things out fast that are buggy, I would scale down the amount of value you're delivering and deliver a quality product. But make sure that there's enough value there that customers are like, okay, this helps me, but I also need A, B, and C, right? Like that's easier to build on. And you might actually learn things. Like you might think that, you're going to build A, B, and C next, and when the gets in the customer's hands, they really want B, C, and D, right? And you realize A is not really that important. So you can save yourself some time there too by getting product in customers' hands. But I am a big fan of getting product out as quickly as possible into customers' hands, getting customers using it, getting customers to get value out of it, and doing that with a relatively small group of customers, making sure they're really happy before you kind of push that out and scale. Because scaling creates all kinds of problems too. You start rolling this rock down a hill, and it's just hard to turn. But I do think getting product out in customers' hands, but making sure it has some value. So whatever that time frame is.
Yeah, because you really only get one sort of first impression. Let's talk about marketing, right? Like, so at the beginning, how did you get your first initial customers, and then how did marketing evolve and change as you started to grow larger and larger?
Yeah, so that's an hour-long conversation probably. So I ran marketing at the beginning of Pendo for the first 4.5, 5 years. A lot of our early customers were reaching out to the network, reaching out to people we knew, reaching out to friends of friends and saying, hey, this is the problem we're solving. Can we show you what we're doing? And really the biggest ask was always like, this is what we're doing. Can we show you a demo? This is what we're doing. Can we show you a demo? We'd post messages on Twitter. We're launching a new product for product managers. We'd love to show it to you. Sign up for a demo. Everything was driving people to those early demos because we wanted people to see product. And we also wanted to practice our pitch, like see what resonated about the story, what didn't resonate, what value prop, people liked, what other ones that they didn't like. So it gave us time not only to revise the product and get product feedback, but also it helped us revise our marketing messaging and our sales approach. But everything early on was very much driven by how can we get more and more demos? And even today, inbound demo requests are huge conversion, opportunities for Pendo, even at our scale. But in the early days, that was like all of what we did. A little bit of thought leadership content because we were experts in the space, so we would invest in that. But the majority of our marketing was driven to can we drive demos? And then the channels we used, we used Twitter, LinkedIn a lot early on, social, and it was really just reaching out to other product managers through friending them, through friend requests, through direct or private messages, and being like, hey, we're launching a product. We'd love your feedback. Check it out. And really, we just wanted feedback. If they happened to buy too, that was great. Or if they wanted to be a customer, that was the cherry on top. But early on, we just wanted to make sure that whatever we were doing had value. And when I say buy, that's misleading too, because we pushed product out there and didn't ask people for money for 8 months. Like we're just like, use the product, get value out of it. We'll talk about money later. Like, can we deliver that value to you? So we spent a lot of time just revamping, continuing to build that product to make sure we were providing value to customers. But the medium for reaching them was a lot of, social media, direct outreach. We were doing Google advertising, spent money on AdWords. We were doing a lot of shows and events, back in the day when we could do those. Unfortunately, we're still sitting in a weird time. Kind of hopefully nearing the end of COVID. But we would do all these grassroots shows. So there were local things called product camps where product managers would get together and have talks. So we'd usually go there and talk and also talk about, set up a table for our solution. And there are really inexpensive ways to reach, 50 to 150 product managers. So we looked at those kind of grassroots things. We did a lot of webinars. So that was kind of a push on the thought leadership side too. So I guess we did do quite a bit of thought leadership as I'm thinking through it. But we did a lot of webinars too, which is like, hey, this is the problem you have. This is how we're approaching solving it. Tell us what you think. Check out a demo of our product.
Right. Where you do organic.
It was fun. And then that evolved to like a really sophisticated marketing program as we continued to grow, right? My approach to marketing is that like you can't focus too much on a single channel. Like if you get Google AdWords working, that's great. But as you're looking to scale from 0 to 100 million in ARR, you can't build a business on one channel. So you have to have social working. You have to have paid advertising working. You have to have thought leadership working, you have to have events working, you have to have all these different channels working. And so you just start iterate. You get a playbook that works for one, and you might be adjusting it as things change over time, but then it's creating those playbooks for all the other different channels and all the different content you have. That it's kind of how marketing changes and grows. And then the big thing is, as you grow, you have a lot more budget to spend and a lot of opportunities to do some new and unique things because of that.
Right. And what about pricing? Because I mean, I checked Pendo, and you guys have like a contact sales sort of thing. Did you guys experiment with pricing? Because pricing is actually something that might seem easy at 100 million ARR, but when you're getting started, it's sometimes difficult to actually figure out, the combo. And I'll give you an example of what I mean, right? Like, so for example, like when I was choosing which, CRM, for lack of a better word, I was going to use for my own team, we were deciding between Slack and Basecamp, right? And so Slack is $7 per user. Basecamp is $97 a month for unlimited users. And so since I have, over 100 people in my company, it was going to be $97 versus $700. And so both of the pricing models are interesting. They both attract a different, set of people and demographics. And how do you decide which one is more appropriate for your company?
Yeah, pricing's hard, and I don't think a lot of startup entrepreneurs really understand pricing. I just recorded. I run a podcast called Product Love, geared to product people. So I just actually recorded a podcast with a pricing expert, and we dug into why this is hard. And not a lot of people have any kind of formal education on pricing. Like, it's not like, hey, in college I took a pricing course. And if you did, it was probably pricing for, manufacturing. It wasn't pricing for software, right? Where it's very, very different. So I do think there's a lack of expertise in pricing. Pricing's a difficult thing, not just at the early stage, but I would argue it's also difficult at the $100 million point. Though you might be able to afford, hiring a pricing expert, a full-time pricing expert on your team. Our pricing changed quite a lot. Like, our prices increased a good bit. That's the other thing I think entrepreneurs need to be okay about, is starting with a price maybe that's lower than you like, because frankly, when you're first launching the product, it's not going to be as good as you want it to be. It's not going to have as many features. It's not going to be as robust. But then as your product grows, don't be afraid to raise pricing. I mean, there's a point where we tripled our pricing, It was a little scary in some ways. Like, you're worried about existing customers and leads and how that's going to hurt pipeline and what that's going to do. And it definitely impacted channels for us. Like, Twitter became a lot more difficult to get leads out of. As it turned out, you don't reach enterprise customers very effectively via Twitter. At least I never did. But I did reach a lot of startups and small businesses via Twitter. So it becomes difficult as pricing goes up. Like, your channels, your messaging changes. You got to adapt to that and realize that your playbooks need to change. But, you can get a lot of power out of pricing. You can get a lot of power out of pricing changes, and also thinking about where your levers are. Is it on a user basis? Is it on a usage basis? Like, there's lots of, levers in the variable pricing that you can use to grow your business too. So, complicated subject that not a lot of people spend enough time on. There's some good resources out there on the internet, but, it's pricing's a challenge for tech companies.
Right. And so what's the end goal for Pendo? Are you guys going to take it public via SPAC? Are you going to sell it to Microsoft? Are you going to keep it, or what are you going to do?
Yeah, I think, an initial public offering always sounds great. I'm personally not sure I 100% get the value out of SPACs. I would be surprised if you go that route. It's not like it's my decision, but you never know. And then as far as being acquired, stranger things have happened. But I think we're growing the company to be a long-term company. We think the product management space is huge. And it's really interesting, if you step back to our initial vision, was improving society's experiences with software. And helping people build better software is just like the first step in that. There's this other consumption side. Like, how do we help people who are users of software use it better, right? How do we train them better? How do we help them adopt software better? How do we help them get value faster? So there's a whole second side of that coin that we're just barely touching today. So I do think this space is huge. I mean, it's as big as, CRM, where Salesforce started. So I think you can build a really, really big company starting with these product foundations and solving these product problems, and being a platform for product, both on the build side and on the consume side. And then that gets us to, how we can improve society's experiences with software, or elevate society's experiences with software as we're describing it today. So, the long-winded answer to your question is, like, it would be great if we continue building this company for a long, long time, and I think there's an opportunity to do that we can keep growing.
I love it. Well, if people want to learn more about you or Pendo, or they want to learn more about your podcast, what's the best place to find you?
Sure. I'm Boduch on Twitter. I'm the only Eric Boduch, I think, on LinkedIn, or at least I used to be, which is kind of crazy. Pendo is just pendo.io, and my podcast is called Product Love. So invite people to subscribe and listen. But yeah, it's pretty easy to reach me. So
awesome. Well, thanks for coming on, Eric. We really appreciate your time, brother, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Kevin. This has been a blast. Enjoyed it.